I just want to ask a question of everyone. Who enjoys drinking wine? Put your hand up so that I can see. Yeah, quite a few.
Oh,
So if
really?
you enjoy drinking wine and you are close to access to wine, please go and grab yourself a drink. I've got one here with me, and that's important for that's part of the
Yeah.
presentation. I'll explain that in a minute. So my topic is Australian wine industry. Probably the first question is, why am I talking about the Australian wine industry? Well, it's because I've actually worked in the Australian wine industry. I worked for a wine company for a few years, and part of that time I actually spent working in the wineries, and I reported to our group chief winemaker, and I worked with all the winemakers in the group. So I actually learned some stuff, mostly about drinking wine. So today's talk is really to just give you an overview of the Australian wine industry, and hopefully it will be something that's interesting. So what we're going to be talking about, just quick overview, and then talk about the wine regions in Australia, talk about the grape varieties, and a couple of comments about winemakers and viticulturists. And then we'll talk about grape harvesters, grape presses, fermentation tanks, barrels and tanks, and then lastly, cellar doors and tasting glasses. So Australian wine production, back in the late 90s, Australia's wine production was about 2% of the world production total, quite small. In fact, the entire production of wine production in Australia in the late 90s were less than the production in Napa Valley in the US. So not huge at all. As you can see from the chart today, that's the 2022 production worldwide. Australia came fifth with 12.7%, which is, probably 5-6-fold what it was back in the late 90s, which is quite significant. It's interesting that Italy is the biggest producer, not France, and Chile is pretty close to Australia, but slightly behind. So statistically, we export about 800 million liters of wine per year, and then we consume ourselves about 500 million liters. And on average, an Australian consumes about 25 liters. I think it depends on which part of Australia you're from as well. Some people drink more than others. And wine is produced in every state, which I thought was really interesting, because if the Northern Territories do produce wine, there probably won't be a lot, and the quality probably won't be fantastic, simply because of the geographic factors and the weather factors. So more than 60 designated wine regions, totaling approximately 160,000 hectares of vineyards. So in wine regions, each of them produce different wine varieties and styles, and that's true based on climates and soil, topography, all those sort of usual factors that affect the grapes. The major varieties are Shiraz, Cabernet Sauvignon or Cab Sav, Chardonnay, Merlot, Semillon, Pinot Noir, Riesling, and Sauvignon Blanc. And there are a number of other ones as well. These are just some of the more common ones. Wines are often labeled with the name of the grape variety, which must constitute at least 85% of the wine. And that's true. So a lot of the times, winemakers actually blend a wine with other different wines to get the effect that they want out of the wine. So it's not necessary because we don't have enough of a particular variety. We're just topping up with other wine to make up for it. Wine cuttings from the Cape of Good Hope were brought to the Penal Colony of New South Wales by Governor Phillip on the First Fleet back in 1788. That's when the first attempt to plant grapes and to produce wine. The attempt wine making from these first vines failed, but with perseverance and other settlers managed to successfully cultivate wines for winemaking. And Australian-made wines was available for sale domestically by the 1820s. And 2 years later, Australian wine was exported overseas and actually won some kind of award overseas as well. So that was the early times. So just some numbers for the 2022-23 vintage, which is basically the latest vintage that we've just had. Just to give you an idea, around this time is when a vintage finishes. Well, depending on the weather needs to be right for the grapes to be picked. So they need to be picked at a particular time. And the winemaker decides when the grapes are picked. So when we talk about vintage, it's basically harvest, but for grapes. So when the vintage is done, then that's when all the winemakers relax and go on holidays and stuff. So this is really probably the busiest time for most winemakers until maybe the end of this month. So the total vineyard area in Australia in 2022 estimated to be about 146,000 hectares. South Australia accounted for 52%, New South Wales 24%, Victoria 15%. The total wine grape crush, Victoria actually had a wine industry a bit earlier than South Australia. The problem was that there was some blight in the vines that affected a lot of the vines, and they all had to be burnt. And after that, some of them had to sort of start from scratch. So it was during that time that South Australia then got ahead and planted a lot more vines. So the South Australian industry the production is a lot bigger than Victoria is at this point, which is not a bad thing because they do produce a lot of very good wines in South Australia. The total wine grape crush in 2023 was 1.32 million tons, of which the top two varieties were Shiraz, 26%, and Chardonnay, 19%. The numbers sort of depends, fluctuates. Just to give you an idea, 1 ton of grapes can produce anywhere between 700 to 900 liters. Depends on the type of grape, depends on the process and some other factors. Australia exported 621 million liters of wine in 2022 to 23, valued at 1.86 billion free on board. The top destination market by value was the UK, accounting for 19% of exports, closely followed by the US, which is also 90%. Hong Kong 10%, Canada 9%, and Singapore 7% are the next big export markets. On the domestic market, Australian wine sales in 2022-23 are estimated to be 444 million litres, making up 82% of the total sales on the domestic market this year. So really roughly out of 5 bottles, 1 is exported, and the rest we drink ourselves. There are estimated to be 2,156 wineries and approximately 6,000 grape growers, that's viticulturists to be precise, employing almost 164,000 full-time and part-time employees across 65 wine growing regions in Australia, contributing to over 45 billion annually to the Australian economy. Now, the figures in 22-23 obviously does not include any wine sales directly to China, because China has banned the import of Australian wines, which has caused a lot of grief to the whole industry. And in fact, there's a glut of wine that's currently in Australia. So one of the things that they've been doing is they just left the grapes on the vines. They don't pick them, they don't crush them, and just let them dry up, and then they cut them down, basically just wasted. But that's unfortunate because they don't have the tanks to store the wine. They don't have the money to process it because they can't sell it, which is a bit of a shame. So now let's have a look at the wine regions of Australia. As you can see, most Northern Territory is obviously up north, and we can't really see any here because only the bigger wine regions are shown here. So total hectares, 146,000 hectares, whatever. And production of varieties, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, Pinot Grigio and Riesling. The red varieties, Shiraz, Cabernet, Sauvignon, Merlot, Pinot Noir, and Grenache. So if you look at the wine regions here, the big ones are Hunter Valley, Yarra Valley, Barossa Valley, and Margaret River. These are probably the better known ones. Clare Valley and Eden Valley are really good for white grapes, white varieties. Clarenvale and Coonawarra are really good for reds, as Heathcote. Riverina is an interesting grape growing area. It's really good for bulk wine. It has the volume, but it doesn't necessarily have the quality. Yarra Valley does produce some good and well-known wines, and Mornington Peninsula does have some wines as well. Interesting that Hobart Tasmania is seen as one big wine region, but that's going to be growing because I think as climate change continues to heat the planet up, the cooler areas in Tasmania now becomes more suitable for wine growing as well. So grape varieties, as we mentioned before, Shiraz, Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, Grenache, Merlot, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, and Riesling. These are the sort of more popular varieties. There are a lot of other ones, and there are some boutique ones, shall I call them, that are coming on board, and more wineries are trying different varieties. So winemakers, as I said before, winemakers, I don't know, any of you seen this ad where the winemakers just sit in a winery cellar full of barrels of wine and play chess and do nothing, most of the time? Well, that's blatantly not true. I've never seen any winemakers play chess. All they do when they're off duty is drink beer. So actually the job is quite intensive, especially during vintage. During vintage, the winemakers almost don't have time to sleep because a lot of the times white grapes need to be picked at night. They then need to be crushed. They need to be processed. And the winemaker will then have to make a decision on what to do with those grape juice, basically, at that point. What to do with those? Do they put them in a barrel? What do they need to add any additives? What do they do with them? And they need to make those decisions ongoing during that time. So once vintage is finished, everything's gone to either a tank or a barrel, then they can relax a bit and they've got more time, so they normally take a holiday after that. But it's a very intense job, actually, and it's something that, you can't say, well, I've got something else on, I'll go on holiday during vintage. Well, if you're a winemaker, you don't have that luxury. You have to be there. You can't Zoom to do it either. You have to be there. You have to be tasting the grapes and doing tests and making sure that you got the right sugar level, that sort of stuff. So on this picture on the left-hand side is Jeff Sharple. He was a Rotarian in the Barossa Valley. He's a friend of mine. We actually, when we got married, we gave everybody who came to the banquet a bottle of white port, and that white port came from his winery, Bethany Wines. And it's a very nice drink. We still have them, and it's still drinkable. So, and the other guy is his brother, who sort of co-owns the winery, which is behind them. Okay, viticulturists or grape growers. They are really another key part of the winemaking process. Just like a good chef would pick the best ingredients to make their creation, their food, and they pick the best, freshest, most in-season ingredients, so does the winemakers always pick the best grapes. And they don't just pick the grapes, they are involved with the winemakers, talk to the grape growers and talk to the viticulturists in determining the best way to grow the grapes, the best time to pick the grapes, and the best method to do so. And there are a few methods of picking the grapes as well, which we'll talk about shortly. Well, this is a grape harvester. It's basically a machine that goes along the row of grapes. And what they do is they've got these plastic fingers on either side inside the machine, so that when they drive through, they basically tap on the grapes so that the grape will fall down into a tray down below to be collected and then crushed. So they don't necessarily do them a whole bunch at a time. Sometimes, obviously, some grapes is better to hand pick, which means that somebody gets a pair of spears and just sort of cut them as they go along. This is the more efficient way of doing it. Sometimes they do it if they have to do it at night or something as well. Sometimes the machine just does it faster. So that might be a reason to use that instead of actual pickers. So what do you do with the grapes after you cut them down? Well, you put them into a press. On the right-hand side is a traditional press where you basically screw the thing down and presses the grapes, and then the juice comes out down the bottom. You got a bucket or something to collect them. That's a traditional way of doing it, and that's got some drawbacks. Obviously, less efficient, but also it may affect the quality of the wine. But stylistically, there's some people who actually prefer it that way. On the left-hand side is a sort of modern commercial grape press. So you chuck the grapes into the middle. Inside of that tube is like an airbag that slowly expands. They pump air into it. And as it expands, it squeezes the grapes until they split open, and then the juice flows out. When the first juice that comes out, they call first run, that is the best quality juice from those grapes. The idea is that if you press it too much, you will force some of the chemicals from the skins to come out, and that's sort of less desirable for the wine. So once they've pressed the juice, they will go into a fermentation tank, depending on what variety it is as well. So if it's a red wine that you're trying to make, you actually put the skin and the meat back into the tank to ferment with the juice. That's how the wine actually gets its color, from soaking in the skin. As you can see, it's much less like, the barrels and stuff you see on TV. Talking about barrels, this is what you normally see in terms of what people talk about when they talk about wineries. You got barrels and lots of barrels of wine. That's true for some, but not all. So these are barrels that they look like hogsheads to me. There are two common types that are used by the wine industry in Australia. Either hogsheads, which is about 250 liters, or barriques, which is a little bit smaller. And I don't know whether you know this, but in barrels, they use the metal hoops to keep them in place, but they don't use nails, they don't use glue. So it's really the skills of the coopers, that is the craftsmen who shape the barrels and shave the barrels and put them into shape. And then the hoops just keep them in place, and that's all they need to prevent any liquid from seeping out. So just looking at these barrels, I know they contain white wine, because if you have red wine in those barrels, the middle strip of it will probably turn red. So for larger wineries, the way to store the wine is to put them into these large tanks, steel tanks. The ones on the left, probably 2, 3, or 400,000 liters each. They are pretty big, and they keep a lot of wine indeed. Now, there are some wines, for example, white wines, when you ferment them, that you actually want to keep them cool. So there are refrigerated wine tanks as well, like the ones on the right. Some of them even, they look white instead of stainless steel, because they have an extra layer of insulation on the outside, and they just have sort of white plastic on the outside. So that's the tanks. Now, I've actually had a chance to talk to some people, and some people actually don't understand the labels on wine bottles. And I just thought I'll quickly go through that with you. Sometimes it's not easy to understand, because there are different ways or different information on the labels of wine bottles. So, for example, down the bottom left, you got Moet Chandon, obviously expensive stuff. Champagne is both the region and the wine type. Brut just means that it's very dry. Imperial is just a label they give for a particular standard of wine. And this one, doesn't actually tell you anything about year or anything like that. So I presume that's a non-vintage. Up top here, that's a bottle of red, Bordeaux. Bordeaux is just a region, a French region, but they only produce red wine. So I know it's red just because it says Bordeaux. That's a chateau. That's just basically the name of the winery. And it doesn't say anything about vintage either. So apparently it's won some medal, which is great. In the middle here is a bottle of red from Australia. On the top is Pyramima, is the name of the winery. McLaren Vale is actually the region. Shiraz is a great variety, and vintage 2019. So that means the wine's actually from the 2019 harvest. And normally for reds, it will take at least 2 to 3 years before the wine is available. So this would have come out probably 21, 22. On the right-hand side, the reason I wanted to share, this says it's won a whole bunch of different gold medals, which sounds fantastic, doesn't it? I mean, obviously, he's won it from so many different places. Must be really good. Well, I'm sure it's a good wine, but that's that's not the best. So in a lot of wine shows, you can win a bronze medal, a silver medal, or gold medal. And then if you really win in that category, you'll win a trophy. So a gold medal is good, but it doesn't mean that it's the best. That's the difference. And that's why, a wine can often win in multiple competitions or shows, winning, all golds or something like that, because it's more like a grade rather than, actual first, second, or third. If you don't know about it, you just say, "Oh, gold medal," so that means it's the best. That's not true. And normally, for each wine show, there's a lot of different categories. So there are multiple gold medal winners. There are multiple trophy winners as well. So yeah, it's still good to win, of course. Now, I don't know does anybody like buying wine from cellar doors? Like you go to a winery and you see some wine, try some wine, and then obviously what a cellar door is, you go to visit a winery and they will have a cellar door, supposed to be, or I guess in the old days, it's literally that, the cellar of a winery where they keep their product, they open their doors and they try to sell the wine there, and people can taste it generally. Tasting is one of the more common things. And you taste it and you go, "Oh, fantastic. Oh, I'll buy them." Well, that's fine. Obviously, you can buy from cellar door. Just be aware that, at least in Australia, generally speaking, cellar door prices are higher than what you can buy from other places. The main reason being that there's an extra cost for the winery to staff the cellar door. And yeah, that's the main reason. So when you go tasting, you will often find that they will give you a glass like this one. If you can see me, that's a standard ISO tasting glass. So why the standard tasting glass? So when you're doing wine tasting, you do two things. You really want to get the aroma of the wine so that you maximize the smell of the wine and before you taste. And the ISO tasting glasses actually give you the ability to swirl the wines to release that aroma, and it helps to concentrate the aroma to your nose so you can actually smell it at the opening of the glass. And it really doesn't matter what sort of wine you have in the glass, it will still have the effect. If you go to buy a very expensive Riedel glass or something like that, they will have different shapes for particular variety of grape, and that's supposed to be that, a particular shape will enhance that particular variety's flavors and aromas. Whereas, and that's fine, but the tasting glasses, they do the same thing for all varieties, not just a particular one. So that's the end of my talk.